What's going on, vinyl community? Welcome to another video with the Record Spinner. In today's video, I'm going to be ranking the Doors studio catalog. The Doors are one of the most beloved psychedelic rock bands, and one that had a sound and ethos that was so distinguished by the fusion of each respective member's influences, whether it was Morrison's poetry, Krieger's Spanish flamenco guitar playing, or Densmore and Manzarek's jazz background. While their history is brief compared to other contemporaries, the impact they made is undeniable and should never be underestimated. As I always say, this ranking is solely my opinion. It is neither right or wrong. If you think Morrison Hotel is their best album, then I respect your opinion, but who knows, maybe we'll see eye to eye on some things. But enough of the chit chat, let's jump into what this video is all about. Now, there are 9 Doors studio albums, and coming in at number 9 at the bottom of the barrel is this one. 1978's An American Prayer. This album was done sometime after the band had broken up, and what it consists of is spoken word poetry done by Morrison with some musical accompaniment from Krieger, Densmore, and Manzarek. Now, the original intent of these spoken word poetry sessions, which date back to a session he did on his 27th birthday, was to do a poetry album with musical accompaniment from composer Lalo Schifrin. So, from the get-go, there was to be no inclusion of any Doors members, which makes me question the integrity of this album. I can see how the other members see this album as a sort of tribute to Jim, hence why it is labeled as a Jim Morrison album with music by the Doors, but it just steers completely away from what the original intent of the project was, and that's why it's low on this ranking. With that said, there are some cool pieces on here, such as Ghost Song and the title track, which uses Albinoni's Adagio in G minor, which is a beautiful piece. And overall, it's an interesting listen, since the remaining members did contribute some new musical compositions, yet also recycle instrumental bits from previous Doors albums, and then there's a random live rendition of Roadhouse Blues as well. It's a bit uneven in places, but I can understand what they were trying to do, and it just comes across as just not too genuine. Coming in at number 8 is this album, 1972's Full Circle. This was the band's last album before they broke up entirely, and this album marks an entire shift for the band. Their longtime engineer Bruce Spotnick chose to not participate in the sessions. The band moved from their rehearsal space to record, and they worked with a slew of top-shelf session players. So where the other post-Morrison album Other Voices germinates from the LA Woman period, this album stands alone on its own. Stylistically, this album works in some more jazz and funk influences, and while I think it is their most musically diverse album, it appears to be rather inconsistent in places. You basically have Manzarek, who wanted to push forward into the jazz realm, and then you have Densmore and Krieger wanting to continue the more rocking sound that they were known for. Whether it's these tensions or the fact that this album didn't do well commercially, the band decided to call it a day. Perhaps the one highlight as well as single on this is The Mosquito, which is some good mariachi fun. The Piano Bird has an interesting Latin fusion touch to it. It's just an album that is all over the place. Coming in at number 7 is this album, 1971's Other Voices. This is the first post-Morrison album. It's been stated that work had commenced on it while Jim was in Paris with the hopes that he would return to finish it, but when he had passed away, they contemplated getting another vocalist, but instead, Ray and Robbie took over the lead vocal duties, and the end result is honestly not too bad of an album. Maybe if the band had rechristened itself, that it wouldn't be overshadowed by the Morrison years, but songs such as In the Eye of the Sun, Varieties, The Spice of Life, and Ships with Sails are good fun. The single Tightrope Ride got some airplay, and that song alone is probably the single defining song of the post-Morrison years. But it goes without saying that the element of Morrison is missing, and his words and charisma added so much to the lore of the Doors. So perhaps it's obvious that the albums that came after he passed sit low in the ranking, but it truly did show the band working through a period of grief and trying to further establish themselves without him, so I do have to give them props in that regard. Coming in at number 6 is this album, 1969's The Soft Parade. Now we get into some classic territory. Musically, this is a very wide-paleted album since producer Paul Rothchild decided to bring forward string and brass arrangements to the band's sound, but it's at this point that the cracks begin to show since Morrison began to withdraw a bit from the writing and recording process, almost having left the band, Krieger increasing his creative input, and the songs being given individual writing credits since Morrison had issues singing the lyrics to the Krieger pen-tuned Tell All the People. So perhaps due to Morrison's lack of interest makes this album a bit uneven in places. The band did earn their last top 10 hit with Touch Me, and there are some other highlights such as Wild Child, Tell All the People, The Beautiful Wishful Sinful, and even the dynamic title track, which is almost takes the mold of pieces like The End and When the Music's Over in terms of long poetic structures, but it's much more dynamic musically and shifts greatly. It's not to say that the experimentation with strings and horns was a failed one, because the arrangements are interesting, but it's almost a step back for the band musically. Coming in at number 5 is this album. 1970s Morrison Hotel. After the displeasing results of the Soft Parade, they returned to a more blues rock type of sound. It may also mark a new era for the band, because while the band was rediscovering their roots, Morrison was also shedding that Lizard King image and going for a more rough and tough kind of look. While this album didn't contain any hits, it's full of amazing highlights. The opening track, Roadhouse Blues, sets the tone for what the band was setting out to accomplish, and they surely succeeded, and it's also one of their most well-known songs. Some other high points are Peace Frog, which then segues into the lovely Blue Sunday, The Spy, Queen of the Highway, such good stuff. They even hark back to their past with a song like You Make Me Real, which they performed back at the London Fog in their early days, and they even dusted off some recorded leftovers, such as Waiting for the Sun from the sessions for the album of the same name, and Indian Summer from their first album. Overall, a solid return to form for the band. Coming in at number 4 is this album. 1968's Waiting for the Sun. This album has some of the band's most politically and militant charged songs, such as The Unknown Soldier and 5 to 1, which are huge highlights in the band's repertoire. They even scored a #1 single with Hello, I Love You, and by this point, they did the big show at the Hollywood Bowl, so they were really riding high. But this album puts the band in an interesting position, because for the previous 2 albums, they were using up whatever Morrison had lyrically, and for the first time, they had come short on material. The original plan was to record a side-long epic called The Celebration of the Lizard, but Paul Rothchild opted not to feature it, oddly, since the lyrics comprise the gatefold of the original album. So instead, the Not to Touch the Earth section was used, and they had to come up with some fresh material. Some of it, such as Love Street and Yes, the River Knows, are truly sensational. In hindsight, I think this album would have been a natural progression if Celebration was featured, but nonetheless, it's still a solid album with strong material. Coming in at number 3 is this album. 1971's LA Woman. This was the band's last album with Jim Morrison before he left for Paris and ultimately passed away. But what an album to wrap up a legacy on, with what critics dubbed the Doors' comeback album. The obvious highlights were also the hits. Robbie Krieger's Love Her Madly, which he dubbed too commercial for the group. The lengthy title track, which features the Mr. Mojo Rising bit, which is an anagram for Morrison's last name. And of course, the soothing Riders on the Storm. The return to their blues roots established on Morrison Hotel is fully fleshed out on this record, particularly with tracks such as Been Down So Long and Car Hiss By My Window. The band also taps into their older repertoire with a rendition of Crawling King Snake and a completely revamped version of Texas Radio and the Big Beat. It's astounding how far the band had come from where they started to this point, which can also be exemplified by the album's opening track, The Changeling. For most fans, this album is the cutoff period and marks the end of the classic run, and what a way to wrap up on with this band firing on all cylinders. Coming in at number 2 is this album. 1967's The Doors. The next 2 were very tough to gauge because they can both be solid contenders for being the Doors' best work, but there is no doubt that the Doors' debut is one of the best debut albums of all time, but also one of the best rock albums ever. And what a bold move to have the first song people hear from you be Break On Through to the Other Side and have a line about getting high. Then you have some brilliant pieces of poetic genius from Morrison with The Crystal Ship and End of the Night. The band taps into their blues roots with their rendition of Backdoor Man, and their psychedelic carnivorous take on the cabaret standard Alabama song completely reinvents the tune. And what a stroke of massive luck it was for guitarist Robbie Krieger to write his very first song, Light My Fire, and it becomes a #1 hit. Then it ends with the 11-minute epic seance, The End, with references to Oedipus Rex in the spoken word section and intense musical buildup. This record pushed so many musical boundaries that no other group would dare to attempt in the mid to late 1960s, and it set the bar high for a brief yet highly influential run. Coming in at #1 is this album, 1967's Strange Days. This album, I feel, perfectly encapsulates the Doors' psychedelic aesthetic at such a high degree. The opening title track has this aura of mystery with one of the earliest uses of Moog synthesizer in rock music, the backwards piano on the intro of Unhappy Girl, and the speed manipulation of white noise on Horse Latitudes mark such a giant sonic step forward from their debut, and the album is one of those classic cases of using the studio as an instrument. Krieger's Love Me Two Times is a solid rocker. People Are Strange is easily one of the standouts in the entire Doors canon. And then you have things like Moonlight Drive and My Eyes Have Seen You, two songs that Morrison sang to Manzarek on that mythologized fateful day at Venice Beach where the two started the band. And it all wraps up with When the Music's Over, which I feel is perhaps the definitive Epic Doors album closer. It's a sensational record, and many, along with myself, will consider it to be their greatest album, and the proof is in the music to justify it. So there you guys go. That is my ranking of the Doors studio catalog. Now, how would you rank their albums? Please drop a comment down below. I'd love to know. And if you enjoyed this video, please go ahead, give it a like, and subscribe to the channel. See you guys in the next video, and most importantly, keep the records spinning.